When HOA Karen stormed onto my ranch flashing a fake badge and tried to arrest me, she had no idea I was the real sheriff. By the time she realized, it was already too late. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like a bad mirage when Karen's golf cart screeched to a crooked stop at the edge of my ranch. Dust billowed around her like she was arriving on some kind of grand parade float, except instead of roses and waving pageant queens, all she had was a wrinkled HOA vest and an attitude bigger than the county line. I was standing out by the fence, watering the wildflowers that had sprung up after the last rainstorm, when I saw her stomp toward me with something shiny clutched in her fist. At first, I thought it was a cell phone, maybe a clipboard, the usual tools of suburban warfare. But no, Karen, in all her glory, had upgraded. She was holding a cheap, tinny badge you could order off the internet for $12.99, waving it in the air like Moses parting the Red Sea. "You!" she barked, jabbing a finger at me like I was an escaped criminal. "You are in violation of HOA Code 4.1, Section C, subsection 12, regarding unauthorized structural modifications." I leaned casually against the fence post, letting the water hose dribble into the dirt. "Is that so?" I asked, squinting up at her from beneath the brim of my hat. Karen puffed up like a pissed-off cat. "As the acting enforcement officer of the Hillside Estates Homeowners Association," she declared, tapping her fake badge for emphasis, "I am placing you under neighborhood arrest. You are required to cease all work immediately and accompany me to the community center for processing." For a moment, there was nothing but the lazy drone of cicadas filling the silence between us. Then, somewhere behind me, Duke, the ranch's unofficial co-sheriff, and 120 pounds of opinionated German shepherd, let out a low, amused woof. I bit back a grin. Not yet. Let her dig her own grave a little deeper. Karen clearly mistook my silence for submission because she took a bold step closer and yanked a pair of plastic zip ties from her fanny pack. They dangled from her fingers like some medieval shackles, ready to slap on the wrists of anyone who dared repaint a barn without proper color approval. "Hands where I can see them," she barked again, a little too gleefully. I set the hose down, dusted off my jeans, and pulled something out of my back pocket. It wasn't a wallet, it wasn't an HOA compliance form. It was my actual county-issued sheriff's badge, polished to a mirror shine by 20 years of real service. Karen blinked at it, like it had short-circuited her brain. Her mouth flapped open once, twice, but no sound came out. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's screen door creaked open. Phones were already starting to record. I tucked the badge into my belt, crossed my arms, and said, nice and easy, "Ma'am, you're trespassing and impersonating a law enforcement officer. I strongly suggest you put those toys away before you make this any worse." The look on her face would have been priceless even without the whole street watching. But with every camera lens now pointed in our direction, it was practically art. And the show was only just getting started. Karen was vibrating with so much misplaced authority that for a second I thought she might actually take flight like some furious suburban drone. She lifted that ridiculous badge again, waving it like she was casting a spell. "You're under HOA arrest," she barked, with all the righteous fury of someone who had seen way too many courtroom dramas and understood exactly none of them. I damn near dropped my lemonade. For a long, heavy moment, I just stared at her, trying to figure out if this was some elaborate prank set up by my neighbors. Maybe hidden cameras tucked behind the mailbox or peeking from behind the mesquite trees. But no, Karen's face was deadly serious, flushed and twitchy, like she thought she was about to bring down a major cartel. "You are hereby ordered," she screeched, yanking a crumpled paper from her back pocket, "to cease all illegal modifications to your property, specifically repainting your barn without obtaining pre-approval from the Hillside Estates Homeowners Association Architectural Review Board." I coughed into my hand to hide a laugh. Illegal modifications? The barn had needed a new coat of paint for months. The old one was so faded you could barely tell it was supposed to be red. And even if I cared about her precious color palette, there wasn't a single rule anywhere in the HOA charter that said I needed their blessing to slap on some fresh paint. I knew, because I had read the entire miserable document front to back the day I moved in, a decision that had made me lose faith in humanity for a solid week. Karen wasn't done. Her voice climbed another octave as she jabbed the fake badge at me again. "If you do not comply immediately, I am authorized to detain you under Neighborhood Code 4.1, subsection 3, section B." There wasn't a section B under 4.1. There wasn't even a subsection 3. Hell, 4.1 wasn't about barn colors. It was about trash can placement. I pushed my hat back a little further on my head and studied her, head to toe. Her outfit looked like she had tried to copy an actual sheriff's uniform from memory. Cargo pants, a short-sleeve button-down, even a pair of knockoff tactical boots. But the illusion was about as convincing as a child wearing a Batman cape. Duke sat beside me, tongue lolling out of the side of his mouth in what I could only describe as a dog's version of a belly laugh. I glanced down at him, then back up at Karen, whose face was now as red as a fire truck and just about as subtle. "You really sure you want to do this?" I asked, voice low and easy, like I was trying to talk a wild horse down from a panic. Karen mistook my calmness for fear. She straightened her shoulders, snapped a plastic zip tie between her hands, and took a menacing step forward. I leaned casually on the fence, the condensation from my glass of lemonade dripping onto the dry, cracked dirt at my feet. This was getting better by the second. In fact, it was about to get downright historic. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice, didn't even put down my lemonade. I just shifted my weight a little, letting the old wooden fence creak under my arm, and nudged the brim of my Stetson up with one knuckle so I could get a better look at the circus happening in front of me. "Mom," I said, the words slow and syrupy as fresh-poured molasses, "before we get too far down this road, mind showing me your credentials?" For a heartbeat, Karen froze. Her hand twitched against the cheap badge pinned to her vest, like it was glued there. You could see the calculations scrambling behind her eyes, trying to decide if she should bluff harder or backpedal. Pride won, as it usually does with people like her. That, right there, was her first mistake. "I don't need to show you anything," she snapped, the words flying out in a spray of spit and self-righteousness. "As the acting enforcement officer, I have full authority to inspect and detain any resident not in compliance with community standards." I raised an eyebrow, just enough to let her know she was digging herself a mighty deep hole. The heat pressed down heavy, cicadas screaming in the background, Duke panting softly at my feet, like he too was waiting to see how bad she was about to make this for herself. Karen puffed up her chest, took another step closer, and brandished a clipboard this time. A battered thing, with a dozen mismatched papers clipped to it, and an HOA logo printed crookedly at the top, like someone's kid had whipped it up in Microsoft Paint. "You have been witnessed engaging in unauthorized property improvements," she declared, jabbing a finger at the freshly painted barn behind me. "And if you do not cease and desist immediately, I will escalate this situation to HOA higher enforcement." There it was, escalate. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Karen talked about the HOA like it was some kind of paramilitary force, ready to roll up with armored golf carts and citation drones. Meanwhile, her backup, Todd and Marlene, were loitering about 30 feet behind her, pretending to inspect a patch of dead grass. They didn't look like they were itching for escalation. They looked like they were trying to evaporate into the scenery. Karen didn't notice. She was too far gone, riding that adrenaline high that comes when someone finally thinks they've seized all the power they've ever craved. Her hands were trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from excitement. She actually thought she was going to arrest me. She thought she was the law out here. I shifted my weight again, casually reaching down to scratch Duke behind the ears. He gave a low, amused rumble deep in his chest, sensing the absurdity thickening in the air. Karen mistook it for submission. That was her second mistake, and this time she wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of what was coming next. It didn't take long for the buzz to start. The neighborhood might have been scattered across acres of scrub and ranch homes, but news traveled faster than a prairie fire in a high wind. Before I could even finish scratching behind Duke's ears, The first curious onlookers started drifting up the dirt road, hands shading their eyes, trying to piece together the spectacle happening at my front gate. Phones appeared like magic. A dozen tiny black rectangles, all held at the ready, recording every second of HOA Karen's one-woman crusade against common sense. A couple of teenagers crouched behind a low stone wall, giggling into their sleeves. Mrs. Pickens from 2 houses down was already narrating the event like a local sportscaster, her voice carrying over the hum of the gathering crowd. "She's got him cornered. Thinks she's got some kind of right. Lord, this is better than bingo night." Meanwhile, Karen was oblivious, or maybe she knew and just didn't care. Her whole body buzzed with the self-satisfaction of someone who thought they were about to go viral for heroism, not stupidity. She waved that clipboard and fake badge around like a toddler showing off a finger painting, oblivious to the collective disbelief settling over the onlookers. Todd and Marlene stood awkwardly off to the side, whispering furiously to each other. Todd kept glancing at the growing crowd like he was trying to do math he wasn't smart enough to solve. How many witnesses did it take before Karen's fantasy of authority collapsed into a public relations nightmare? Judging by how pale he was turning, the answer was less than this. Marlene clutched her own clipboard like a life preserver, sneaking nervous looks at me, at Karen, at the deputy's cars parked down the road, cars she must have only just noticed because she turned even paler and shuffled back a step. And Duke, good old Duke, he stayed perfectly planted by my side, tongue lolling, ears flicking, eyes bright with what I could only describe as pure, doggy disbelief. Every time Karen puffed herself up to screech something new about legal consequences and sovereign HOA jurisdictions, Duke cocked his head to the side like he was trying to work out what species she actually belonged to. I gave him a slow, deliberate scratch behind the ears. "Easy, boy," I murmured. "Show's just getting started." The air was thick with heat, dust, and the unmistakable scent of brewing disaster. Neighbors leaned on pickup trucks, perched on porch rails, and huddled together like old-timers settling in for a fireworks show. Except this time, the fireworks weren't going to be in the sky. They were going to go off right here, at my gate, in the form of one very entitled, very doomed HOA Karen, and I wasn't going to have to lift a single finger to light the fuse. I let her have her moment, let her bask in the shaky glory of her fake badge and her trembling clipboard. Let the cameras soak in every second of it, every twitch of righteous fury playing out in high definition for the whole neighborhood to savor later. Then, when the silence stretched just a little too long and Karen demanded again, shrieked really, that I submit to neighborhood authority, I finally moved, slowly, deliberately, like a man with all the time in the world. I reached into my back pocket, casually brushing past my wallet, past the folded-up receipts from the feed store, and pulled out the one thing that could cut through her delusion faster than a knife through warm butter: a badge. Not the flimsy toy she was brandishing, not a dollar store special ordered from a shady website with "official" misspelled. No, this was a real badge. A county sheriff's badge, heavy enough to leave a dent if you dropped it, polished bright enough to catch the late afternoon sun and throw it back in her face. I held it up between 2 fingers, letting it gleam for a long, delicious second before tucking it casually into the belt of my jeans. No fanfare, no announcement, just enough movement for every single person in the crowd to see it. The effect on Karen was instantaneous. Her face drained of color so fast it was like watching the air get sucked out of a balloon. One second she was a storm, blustering and booming. The next, she was a twitching, sputtering mess, her mouth working silently like a fish yanked out of water and dropped onto a sun-baked dock. Behind her, Todd took an audible step backward. Marlene clutched her clipboard to her chest like it might physically shield her from the consequences crashing down around them. I straightened up just a little, the Stetson casting a sharper shadow across my face now. The neighbors leaned in, sensing the moment, the climax they hadn't realized they were hoping for until now. "Ma'am," I said, my voice even and steady, "you are trespassing on private property." Karen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Some distant part of her seemed to realize that sovereign HOA jurisdiction wasn't going to cut it anymore, not when the man standing in front of her carried the real weight of the law. And, I continued, as casual as if I was commenting on the weather, you are impersonating a law enforcement officer. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and landed in the dust with a pathetic thump. Her hands hovered in the air, twitching, as if she wasn't sure whether to reach for her fake badge, her phone, or maybe just to sprout wings and fly the hell out of there. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence was louder than applause, thick with satisfaction, heavy with the sweet scent of justice, finally catching up to arrogance. Karen blinked rapidly, still clinging to the last fraying shreds of her fantasy. But it was too late. Way too late. And things were about to get a whole lot worse. For a second, I thought she might actually do the smart thing. Karen's face was still a sickly shade somewhere between bad mayonnaise and chalk dust, and her hands fluttered uselessly at her sides, like birds trapped in a too small cage. But then, because pride always dies the loudest death, she rallied. With a sudden, explosive inhale, Karen planted her feet in the dust, jabbed a trembling finger at my barn, and launched into what could only be described as a screeching, barely coherent monologue of fake authority. As acting enforcement officer of Hillside Estates HOA and representative of the Neighborhood Preservation Charter, she shrilled, voice cracking under the strain, I am empowered by citizens' arrest statutes and internal community bylaws to detain and cite any resident found in material breach of architectural compliance. It was almost impressive, the way she managed to stack that many nonsense words into a single breath. Somewhere off to my left, Mrs. Pickens let out a noise suspiciously close to a cackle. A few of the teenagers ducked behind a truck, shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Karen didn't notice. She was too deep into her own fever dream. She whipped out a stapled packet of papers from a folder she must have been carrying, pages flapping wildly in the hot breeze. According to the amended Charter of 2021, she bellowed, barns shall not exceed acceptable aesthetic parameters, including, but not limited to, hue saturation limits, texture uniformity, and appropriate visual integration with community color standards. Hue saturation limits, texture uniformity. I almost choked trying to hold back a laugh. Duke, bless him, let out a snort and flopped down at my boots, belly to the dirt, rolling his eyes in a way that made half the onlookers quietly lose it. Karen charged ahead, now fully unhinged. You are also in direct violation, she said, riffling through her papers and triumphantly stabbing a page with her finger, of Section 7, Code B14, regarding unauthorized livestock behavior. Your dog, she practically spat the word, has been observed performing aggressive facial gestures against board members. Aggressive facial gestures. I blinked at her, wondering if she actually believed what was coming out of her mouth, or if she was just too far gone to stop. Behind Karen, Todd looked like he was about to bolt. Marlene was mouthing silent prayers to whatever deity covered HOA disasters. Karen flapped the clipboard again, like it might summon some sort of HOA SWAT team from the heavens. Stand down immediately, she shrieked. Submit yourself to community correction or face maximum administrative penalties. The crowd was loving it. Phones were up. Whispered jokes flew back and forth. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't smiled in a decade, was leaning against his cane and chuckling under his breath. I shifted my weight lazily, the badge on my belt catching the sun again. Karen's eyes flicked to it for just a moment, but she shoved the reality away with one last desperate shriek about imminent enforcement protocols. It would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Scratch that. It was funny, and we hadn't even gotten to the good part yet. The cavalry arrived without sirens, just the low crunch of tires on gravel and a soft whoop of a siren chirp to announce their presence. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs rolled up side by side, dust trailing behind them like some old Western posse arriving for a standoff. Karen didn't notice right away. She was too busy spinning herself into another paragraph of nonsense about citizen compliance and mandatory barn inspections. Her voice, raw from shouting, cracked like an old screen door every time she tried to inject official procedure into her rants. I turned, lazy and casual, just in time to watch Deputies Moore and Vasquez step out of their vehicles, both seasoned enough to have seen some truly weird calls, but nothing quite like this, if their barely contained grins were anything to go by. Moore, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a face like he carved it out of granite, took one look at Karen, flailing her laminated official documents in the air, and shot me a glance. Not a word passed between us, but the look said it all. This is going to be good. Vasquez, shorter and wirier, adjusted his belt and strolled up next to him, raising an eyebrow as Karen barked something about detainment rights under emergency HOA statutes. Karen finally caught the shift in energy, noticed the two real deputies standing there, badges glinting real authority in the sunlight, and for a split second her whole body froze like a squirrel spotting a hawk overhead. Then, unbelievably, she doubled down again. "I am currently executing a lawful neighborhood arrest," she screeched, thrusting her knockoff badge toward Moore, like it might actually stop him mid-stride. "This man," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "is resisting HOA compliance regulations and must be immediately sanctioned." Moore tilted his head slightly, inspecting her like she was an exotic species he hadn't seen before. Vasquez didn't even pretend. He grinned outright, tugging the brim of his hat lower to hide it. "And who exactly authorized you to perform?" Moore paused, visibly struggling not to laugh. "This neighborhood arrest?" Karen puffed up again. "The charter, the articles of homeowner conduct." She rifled through her papers and thrust out a wrinkled page at him like she was slapping down the Constitution. Moore took it, glanced at it, and then turned it sideways, upside down, and back again, as if trying to make sense of the gibberish. "Uh-huh," he said finally. "And you got this authority? Where, exactly?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was rebooting. "From the annual meeting vote," she shouted. "The emergency bylaws grant enforcement power during a non-compliance event." Behind them, the crowd grew thicker, cameras recording every humiliating second. Moore handed the paper back to her, as delicately as if it were covered in something unpleasant. "Ma'am," he said, voice dropping into that low, dangerous calm real lawmen use when the stupid is about to get someone arrested. "You're aware impersonating a law enforcement officer is a felony in this county, right?" Karen blinked. For the first time, something like real fear flickered across her face. Finally. It was about damn time. For a heartbeat, everything held perfectly still, the air thick, the heat pressing down, the crowd silent in collective anticipation. Karen's eyes darted wildly between Moore, Vasquez, and me, trying to calculate some invisible math where she could still come out the hero of this rapidly crumbling disaster. Then, in an explosion of panic and bad judgment, she screamed. "This is a violation of my sovereign HOA rights," she wailed, voice cracking so hard it startled a couple of crows out of a nearby tree. "You're all in breach. You're all going to be reported to the Regional Compliance Authority." There was no Regional Compliance Authority. That wasn't a thing. It was a fever dream cobbled together from too many HOA board meetings and bad television procedurals. But Karen wasn't done. She fumbled at the tactical belt slung around her hips, a dollar store special, sagging under the weight of zip ties, a tiny plastic flashlight, and what looked suspiciously like a children's first aid kit, and yanked out a bundle of cheap plastic restraints. Her hands shaking, she stumbled toward me, brandishing the zip ties like they were some kind of magic lasso that would restore her crumbling authority, if only she could slap them on my wrists. "I am authorized to detain non-compliant residents by force if necessary," she screeched, lunging forward, trying to loop the flimsy plastic around my wrists. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I didn't have to. Duke did. The big German shepherd, who up until now had been lounging in the dirt, looking about as dangerous as a bag of marshmallows, rose to his feet in one fluid, silent motion. He didn't bark, didn't snap. He just let out a low, rolling growl that vibrated in the soles of everyone's boots. Karen froze, mid-lunge, the zip ties dangling from her fingers, trembling like a leaf in a thunderstorm. Slowly, very slowly, she looked down into Duke's face. His calm, golden stare locked dead center on her every twitch and breath. His lip curled back just slightly, not a snarl, just enough to show that if she was thinking about moving even a millimeter closer, it would be a profoundly bad decision. Karen's fingers went slack. The zip ties dropped to the ground with a sad little plop, landing right next to her abandoned clipboard. Vasquez chuckled under his breath. Moore shook his head in open disbelief, one hand resting casually on the cuffs at his belt. The crowd, still silent, collectively shifted forward a step, drawn in like moths to the biggest social bonfire the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen stumbled back a step, her composure cracking wide open. Her hair, once immaculately shellacked into a tight bun, had started to frizz under the heat and humidity, little strands sticking out like frantic antennae. Sweat soaked the back of her HOA vest, turning it several shades darker than it had started. And finally, the reality settled over her like a lead blanket. She wasn't the sheriff. She wasn't the law. She was a trespasser about 2 bad decisions away from wearing real handcuffs. And this time, they wouldn't be made of cheap plastic. Moore took a slow step forward, resting his hand lightly on his belt right above the real, government-issued handcuffs that Karen was about to get very familiar with. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bark orders. He just said it plain and flat, the way you might tell someone the sky was blue. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dangerously polite, "you are being detained under suspicion of impersonating a law enforcement officer, criminal trespass, and attempted unlawful detainment." Karen stood frozen for a second, her mouth moving, but no sound coming out, as if the gears in her brain had finally ground to a halt under the weight of reality. Then, like somebody had cut a brake line, she exploded into shrieking hysteria. "You can't do this!" she howled, stomping one foot so hard a puff of dust shot up around her sandal. "I have sovereign rights. HOA supersedes local jurisdiction under community preservation laws." She whipped her fake badge out again like it was a crucifix that could ward off actual authority. Nobody moved. Nobody even humored her. The crowd was dead silent, except for the faint buzz of phones recording everything. Somewhere off to the side, I saw Mr. Jenkins discreetly turn up the volume on his hearing aids, clearly not wanting to miss a syllable of this unfolding masterpiece. Karen's face flushed beet red as she pointed frantically from Moore to Vasquez to me, flinging accusations like confetti at a pity party no one else had RSVP'd for. "I'll sue you! I'll sue the whole county!" she shrieked, her voice cracking higher with every word until she sounded like a bad violin solo. "I'll have your badges. I'll own this town. She never finished the threat because Moore, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone used to dealing with wild drunks at the county fair, stepped forward, gently took her by the wrist, and turned her around. The snap of the handcuffs closing over her wrists was so satisfying that a few people in the crowd actually sighed like they were settling in to watch the third act of a really good play. Karen shrieked again, yanking once against the cuffs, but Moore wasn't having any of it. He tightened the grip just slightly and leaned in close enough that whatever he said next was just for her. Whatever it was, it shut her up fast. Vasquez collected her clipboard and fake badge, handling them like they might be contagious, and bagged them up as evidence. Karen, meanwhile, was frog-marched toward the waiting cruiser, screeching about civil lawsuits, massive damages, and how she had the HOA's full legal backing, which, judging by the way Todd and Marlene were now trying to blend into a shrubbery across the street, didn't seem entirely accurate. I stayed leaned against the fence, arms folded, Duke seated loyally at my side, watching the entire show unfold with a kind of serene satisfaction you couldn't fake if you tried. Nobody looked impressed by her promises. Nobody offered help. If anything, a few folks waved her off with mock salutes as Moore loaded her into the back seat and slammed the door with a finality that rang through the hot, dusty air. And just like that, The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was officially dethroned, still screaming about lawsuits no one cared about and rights she never had. As soon as the cruiser door slammed shut behind Karen, her muffled howls still echoing from inside, Todd and Marlene sprang into action. You could practically see the survival instincts firing off behind their nervous, darting eyes. Todd, never known for bravery even on his best days, took 2 clumsy steps backward, hands raised like he was trying to surrender to an invisible firing squad. Marlene clutched her clipboard to her chest, her fingers white-knuckled around the plastic edges, eyes wide and pleading as she scanned the deputies, the crowd, anyone who might believe the lie she was about to sell. "We had nothing to do with this," Todd barked, his voice cracking like a boy trying to grow into a man too fast. "We didn't know she was gonna, do all that." His words tumbled out so fast they almost collided with each other. Marlene bobbed her head in frantic agreement. "She said she just wanted to observe. We thought she had permission. We didn't authorize any arrests." There was a long, heavy pause where the weight of their cowardice hung in the air like the stench of skunk spray. Nobody looked impressed. Vasquez lifted an eyebrow so high it almost disappeared under the brim of his hat. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The neighborhood had already decided. Todd and Marlene were throwing Karen under the bus so fast they didn't even stop to check if the tires were still spinning. Mrs. Pickens, standing nearby with her phone openly filming, muttered loud enough for the nearest 10 people to hear, "Look at these rats abandoning the ship. No shame, no damn shame at all." Across the street, a few of the teenagers who had been filming since the beginning burst into open laughter, egging each other on as they zoomed in and captured every twitchy, guilty flinch. Todd, realizing they weren't getting the sympathetic reaction they hoped for, tried again, his voice rising higher and more desperate. "Look, we didn't even want to be here. Karen said it was all official. She told us she had a legal mandate." Marlene, bless her panicked little heart, decided it was a great time to shuffle through her clipboard for something, anything, that might save them. She fumbled out a sheet and held it up like it was a holy document, her voice trembling. "We just came to supervise," she blurted, "to make sure she followed procedure." The sheet she held up wasn't a legal form. It was a printed-out neighborhood potluck flyer from 2 months ago. Even more, as straight-laced as they came, gave the tiniest shake of his head, like he couldn't quite believe how fast they were self-destructing. The crowd, meanwhile, had fully committed to documenting the crash and burn in real time. Phones were up, flashes blinking occasionally in the late afternoon sun, voices whispering eagerly as neighbors began exchanging predictions about who would flip on who next. Todd finally threw his hands up, palms out. "We disavow everything," he shouted. "Karen acted on her own." Marlene nodded so hard her buns started unraveling. It was the fastest, sloppiest mutiny anyone had ever seen, and it was only just getting started. The timing couldn't have been better if I had scripted it myself. As Karen's furious, red-faced wailing faded into the thick air, muffled by the heavy steel of the cruiser's doors, I straightened up from my spot at the fence, dusted off my jeans, and pulled out a folder I'd been saving for just this kind of day. A thick, satisfying folder. The kind that snapped when you bent it, packed with so much documentation it could have doubled as a blunt weapon. I walked it over to Moore with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly what kind of hammer he was about to drop. He took it without a word, flipping open the cover with a practiced flick of his fingers. Inside, he found the whole sorry saga neatly organized. Screenshots of HOA emails demanding I repaint my barn in approved earth tones or face escalating fines. Photographs of Karen and her loyal sidekicks lurking near my property line with their clipboards like a pack of underqualified bounty hunters. Security footage from my cameras, time-stamped, high-res, crystal clear, showing unauthorized inspections, threats, and one particularly entertaining video of Todd tripping over a sprinkler head during a midnight compliance patrol. I had it all. Moore thumbed through the pages, nodding slowly. Every few seconds he muttered something under his breath, things like unlawful entry, abuse of authority, And my personal favorite, conspiracy to violate property rights. Vasquez leaned over his shoulder, chuckling low when he reached the page where Karen had emailed the HOA board, suggesting they find a way to forcibly ensure compliance with neighborhood aesthetic goals, followed by 3 exclamation points and a poorly drawn smiley face. "Y'all did most of our job for us," Moore said dryly, closing the folder with a snap that echoed off the pavement. Meanwhile, Karen in the back of the cruiser had moved past, screaming into a sort of wounded, keening noise, pounding weakly on the window with the palms of her hands. Todd and Marlene edged further away, trying to fade into the backdrop, like 2 really bad extras in a school play. Moore looked at me, then back at the cruiser, then at the folder in his hand. "With this," he said, tapping it against his palm, "we're looking at more than just impersonation and trespass." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" He nodded grimly. "Multiple counts of harassment, tampering with private security systems, attempted coercion under false pretenses. Might even stick her with obstruction of justice if the DA's feeling spicy." Vasquez grinned. "She's about to collect charges like it's Black Friday at a clearance sale." The neighbors had gathered closer now, no longer pretending they weren't riveted. Phones recorded every second as Moore waved a second deputy over to start taking formal witness statements. Mrs. Pickens volunteered first, practically elbowing past the teenagers to be next in line. She even brought her own printed notes, in color. Karen's house of cards wasn't just falling apart. It was going down in flames, and everyone had brought popcorn. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and deep, dusky purple by the time the last patrol car pulled away. A warm breeze stirred the dust across the driveway, carrying with it the faint smell of cut grass, fresh paint, and something sweeter, the scent of justice served cold. I settled into my old porch chair with a long, contented sigh, Duke thudding down beside me with the heavy grace of a dog who knew his job was done for the day. A tall glass of sweet tea sweated in my hand, ice clinking gently every time I lifted it for a slow sip. Down the road, the flashing lights had been replaced by the headlights of news vans creeping past like sharks. Word had gotten out, fast. Apparently, local HOA officer arrested for impersonating sheriff, made for irresistible headline material. One of the channels even tried to catch me for a comment, but I just tipped my hat and kept on rocking, letting Duke's low growl encourage them to keep their distance. Neighbors started trickling in not long after the sun dipped behind the hills. Not with demands, not with complaints, but with offerings. Pies, casseroles, a 6-pack of good beer tucked under someone's arm. Mrs. Pickens, bless her, brought an entire tray of deviled eggs and a victory hug so fierce I thought she might dislocate my shoulder. "About time someone stood up to that nonsense," she said with a grin that showed every proud wrinkle around her eyes. I just nodded, accepting the thanks with a polite smile, saying little. No need to gloat, no need to preach. Everyone had seen it unfold with their own eyes. Karen's undoing, wrought entirely by her own greedy hands and delusions of grandeur. Todd and Marlene had been noticeably absent all evening, no doubt holed up in their houses praying the fallout wouldn't splatter too much on them. I didn't give them a second thought. They'd made their choices. Let them stew in it. Across the street, kids were riding their bikes again, parents chatting freely on front porches. It was like the whole neighborhood had exhaled a breath it didn't realize it was holding. No more surprise inspections, no more passive-aggressive notes, no more Karen. Duke lifted his head, ears flicking toward the road as another news van slowed down for a hopeful shot of the infamous scene of the crime. I gave them a little 2-finger salute without even getting out of my chair, and they rolled on without stopping. I leaned back, letting the old wood creak beneath me, and took another long sip of tea. It tasted sweeter than usual tonight. Maybe because it wasn't just sugar in the glass. It was the simple, lingering satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, you don't have to lift a finger to win. You just have to let fools destroy themselves nice and slow while you sit back and enjoy the view. And out here, under the open sky, I had the best seat in the house.